Okay, so I'll talk about environmental justice, and I have this global in the brackets. Um, well, I think because we are talking about policies like bioeconomy, if we talk about environmental justice, we have to take that global perspective. But B is also probably because of my background. As Jacopo said, I've mainly worked on the impacts of international and EU policies somewhere else on the ground and so on. So yes, my talk today would be, those are the three main points. So why global environmental justice in EU bioeconomy? What does it mean for whom? And then I will kind of summarize or conclude with some policy options or that emerge from this point of view and perspective of justice. So I will start first with three issues and a number of graphs, all of which give a kind of a more general background or reasons as of why justice is important. And this is the first one on unequal distribution of wealth. So we see that globally, the richest 10% own between 60 and 80% of the wealth, while the poorest half of the world's population owns less than 5%. And this is distributed per regions of the world here on this graph and for different continents, but you can find, this is from the World Inequality Report, and you can find the data for each country. We see really big diversity even in the same country, quite a lot. Okay, so why talking about wealth if the theme is environmental justice? Of course, wealth inequality relates a lot to carbon inequality. So the higher the wealth concentration, like in fewer hands, the higher carbon emissions, and the same is true for resource use, but at the moment, this is only about inequality of carbon. So similar figures here. This graph shows the world population by income in relation to CO2 emissions. So globally, in average, the richest 10% emit close to half of the consumption-based emissions, while the poorest 50% contribute to only about 10% of the total consumption-related emissions. So I just added this morning. There came just this week a new Oxfam report, which shows, for instance, that 125 billionaires, I mean, their wealth is associated with 393 million tons of CO2 per year, which is equivalent to the annual carbon emissions of France. And for France, specifically, the wealth of 63 French billionaires contribute to the carbon footprint of the half of the wealth of the 50% of French households. Just thought that these are some really mind-blowing figures for me, and wanted to bring them in here. The third reason is the killing of environmental and land defenders. These are mostly indigenous and local communities protecting their land from mining, land acquisitions for various activities. Here we see mining, agribusinesses, logging, and so on. And the last decade has been really deadly one for environmental and land defenders, where 1,733 people have been killed, which is one murder every second day. So beyond these more general trends, when talking about why justice is important in policies concerning environment, we can differentiate between instrumental and more kind of moral or ethical perspectives and reasons. So instrumental, if we are policymakers like you are here, we can say that, okay, it's important to have justice and justice is central for the very success of the policy and for sustaining this policy over time. And we can be sure that as long as the policy replicates the existing or create new injustices, either domestically or globally, that it will be challenged, resisted, and eventually dismissed. And we have seen some policies recently in the EU, like FLEGT VPA, for instance, that has been dismissed, or at least part of it. So that is one part of the story. The other one, and in my view, more valid point if we are talking about justice, is the moral responsibility for justice. Now, this moral responsibility is both material and is both material and immaterial, and also historical and contemporary. So I have listed here some some points. And the first being the historical perspective and colonial history. So now the history bound us as Europeans to recognize our colonial past and to act accordingly, recognizing and taking responsibility for it. Because if we don't, we are likely to reproduce, to continue replicating some of the similar injustices, dominations, mindsets, and some argue that we have continued to do that. And hence there is this notion that you have been, maybe you have heard about these neo-colonial tendencies. So what does this mean? So it's like we see neo-colonial tendencies, let's say, in relation to inequalities in global production and consumption patterns, also appropriation of resources, land and labor from the global south for maintaining quite high economic standards and economic growth in higher income economies. It's also evident in asymmetric power relations, well, for instance, global trade, which disproportionately benefit and burden different parts of the world. And arguably this, tend to follow these historical colonial lines. So then there is also the issue of climate injustice and responsibilities, which I'm not going to define, but we can go back to it. But just this calls for some of points like climate reparations and debt cancellation for developing countries. And we can, why this debt cancellation will be important is not only a maybe perspective of justice, but also climate, because many of these countries still need to dig oil in order to pay their old debts to IMF and so on. So finally, there is also that epistemological part and burden and domination. And I think also Tom mentioned it in the, I think you called it epistemic colonization, but basically meaning imposing on our own worldviews, values, and knowledge systems elsewhere, for instance, with our policies and development programs and projects. Okay, so in relations to bioeconomy, going more still specifically, we have the number one would be, in terms of why justice is important, is the global implications, because likely the bioeconomy is going to grow. Our already EU's ecological footprint is already big, but the demand for biomass and bio-based products is likely to grow, and deforestation in tropics is growing. And okay, I'm simplifying, and I'm not going to go in, because I think this is more or less, I'm getting the impression that the people agree within these lines that we have an issue of whether biomass is going to be enough or not. And we also see interesting trends that the EU's forest cover increase while we are exporting basically deforestation somewhere else. There is a lot of issues or literature showing that there is an increase in local conflicts, competition between food and bio-based products, and so on and so forth. The second point is also how we select some policy problems and solutions. So in bioeconomy, we tackle some problems and some are dismissed. So for instance, we focus on carbon emissions, but not emission inequality. It's just an example to kind of say that, and that this then means that we bring for some solutions like energy transitions, decarbonizations, renewables, and so on, but not our own overconsumption. So what we choose to be a policy problem worth solution that justifies and legitimizes further action, but also inaction. So we have, for instance, as I said, renewables. So this, some of the solutions like nature conservation, for instance, or carbon offsetting, they disproportionately burden and benefit different societies. So for instance, some of us, we can say, okay, I can offset my flying or something, but what does this mean somewhere else? Somebody will need to be relocated or not farm so that I can, have some extra trees being grown and so on. So these are all some of the points that justify why really justice and global justice is key. Bio-based doesn't mean conflict-free, and this is one study from my colleagues who were looking at globally at some of the conflicts within the renewables and non-renewables. And what they find is that there are similar conflicts and oppression in renewables and non-renewable sectors. and I think it's a bit small, but biomass and land and hydropower are quite high on all of these criminalization of activities that of activists, corruption is really high, and so on. Most impacted are, of course, poor, indigenous, rural people of color, women, and so on. And we need to, we really, basically, what I summarized from here is that unless we challenge the exploitative relations between humans and between humans, between us, some humans, and somewhere else, the humans, and between humans and non-humans, the power structures as well, the mindsets, and the level of consumption, and of course, that means injustices related to those high levels of consumption. We will simply reproduce the same forms of injustices, extractivism, and socio-ecological crisis. Sorry, I'm being so pessimistic. Of course, there are also other things that are important, like procedural justice, representation, recognition of different societal groups in the decision making. So who makes the decisions for whom, at what scale the decisions are made, what authorities are recognized. Usually, for instance, we only at the EU level or UN, we always discuss only with states, but in these post-colonial countries, you have authorities that are not non-state and parallel to legal pluralism. You have indigenous communities, and it's a lot of issues to think there. Cognitive or is epistemic injustice and justice, so whose values, knowledges, whose visions and worldviews are represented in these concepts like bioeconomy. And I think the previous speaker gave a good like food for thinking here, like whether, you know, our Western scientific visions and values are exported or imposed elsewhere and so on. Okay, now in terms of theory and the frameworks of environmental justice. So I first want to just stress that the environmental justice did not emerge in science or policy, but really on the streets. And back, for instance, in 1970s, Black and other marginalized communities in the US were uprising against environmental racism. From there, science and eventually policy followed up. And nowadays we are talking about environment. I mean, there is a like even the field of science called environmental justice in environmental social sciences, and we are talking about green transition and so on. But I think it's important to highlight that social movements are really key in pursuing some of the changes, right? So one of the most used framework of environmental justice is the so-called three-dimensional justice. So we here see the procedural justice, distributional justice, and recognitional justice. So the procedure, you can, well, you know, it's about participation and representation in decision making. The distribution would then be how the harms versus benefits are distributed among different societal groups, and also how resources are distributed, right? Then the recognitional justice deal with recognizing the differences and recognizing the the rights of different culture, race, identity, and so on. Now, this framework has emerged from Western scientific traditions and theories of ethics, and it works pretty well in the parts of the world, like many European countries, where there is a certain level of homogeneity in terms of political and legal structures, but also ideological and philosophical views. I mean, sure, we have differences, but there is, for instance, one political authority. We have only states, so it's about people participating, for instance, in state-led institutions, and yeah. Then we also it's similar with knowledges. We do have local knowledges, but still there is that similar mindset, for instance, in terms of human-nature relations, when compared to post-colonial states where you have indigenous traditional authorities and indigenous knowledges, and there is a really competition for legitimacy between these two systems. Now, what happens often is when we use this kind of a framework in our policies or in studies, and they are usually used somewhere else, kind of to mitigate harm, it happens ironically that these kind of visions can reproduce the harm. So as a result, Alternative approaches to justice have been proposed by indigenous and also decolonial scholars. It's often referred in the literature as decolonial environmental justice framework, but we don't have to put much attention to that. What that basically means is just, I will go very quickly through this, but for instance, the argument is to expand this kind of notion. So for instance, in terms of distributional justice, the decolonial environmental justice suggests the need for rethinking the idea of objectifying and distributing nature, because nature is not in their vision, object that can be just possessed, or at least not in all of these people's visions, right? Instead of recognition and recognizing other cultures and identities, this framework suggests the need for self-determination, because people can, we as external people cannot define them through our lenses and understandings, right? So they have a right to self-determination. Instead of participation within the dominant structures and authority, it demands the right to, self-governing authority, where indigenous and other traditional authorities have the right to govern their ways using their own legal structures instead of participating in stateless structures. So it's maybe a bit too much to process now, but the idea is just to show that we often reproduce injustices out of best intentions, out of best, motivations. What are some of the policy options? How much time do I have? I think I'm doing well. Let's see. Okay, so these are the key 4 points. They are just, they can be challenged. They are non-exhaustive, but I thought if I put there 10, it will be even more difficult. So one point is really reducing the overconsumption and promoting sufficiency in the EU. And for those interested in this point, we will have tomorrow a keynote on degrowth and sufficiency-oriented living, because this is one of the main drivers of lots of injustices happening, from dispossession to relocation of, wide spectrum of issues. Then also taking responsibility for the history, so kind of trying to incorporate that historical perspective, discuss maybe climate reparations, debt cancellation, as I said, for various reasons, also because of, if for nothing else, really to help the whole globe transition to a more safe living, because many of these countries are preparing for a really unstable futures, and they cannot do it if they need to, if they have to follow the rules that the rules of world economy that there is now. It's very difficult for them to even just develop in a way that is not sustainable. Let alone to really invest in renewables and so on. Changing the process of policy problems and solution designs. I will unpack this one next. And then improving the, I'm thinking that in many policies, we really need to think through the perspective of improving the position. This may be empowerment or any other ways of the most vulnerable groups. So for instance, in bioeconomy, the small scale producers, both illegal and legal, rural communities in the biomass provisioning regions, EU and wider. So for instance, when this point of problems and solutions design, when defining policy problems and solutions, if we have justice at the core of it, there's a need to move from this self-centrism to self-reflectionism. What I mean is that from what the EU wants to do, what is in interest of the EU, to really think, okay, what we can do to reduce our own impact. So kind of internally looking also at our performance. Also bridging the gap between where policy is designed and where it has an impact, because usually lots of environmental policies have that spatial relocation. They need to be, resolved somewhere else. like offsetting, for example. Reducing pressure, demands, and interventionalism. So kind of, I know that it's difficult to make a policy that is all-encompassing, but instead of perhaps defining a lot and all the vocabulary and all the concerns and so on, we need to make space for some for the policies would, or laws, or not laws, we don't have, well, some international law is there, but still to kind of leave space for local concerns and knowledges in whatever way. Of course, obviously, I don't have an answer how that can be done, but if we want it to be done, there will be a way. So when acting in post-colonial states, which is most of Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, considering there is a need to really be more concerned or considerative of pluralistic and legal pluralistic legal and cultural structures, but also pluralistic knowledges and knowledge systems, the indigenous authorities, multi-species justice. Maybe we can, I was already having some questions to Tom about multi-species justice, what this interconnectedness means for justice for other than humans visions. And the last one, maybe, yeah, what we are doing here, really challenging the dominant mainstream positions and paradigms and encouraging, embracing different visions and values in a way of that we try to open more space for different options and solutions. This is from my last paper, not last, but this is last slide from a paper where I've been trying to identify some of the main barriers for justice in the bioeconomy 2018 strategy. And I'm not going to go through this, but a lot is repetition. So I'm talking about reciprocal and regenerative relations within humans and the rest of nature, policy-supported sufficiency-oriented lifestyle and production. So instead of focusing only on the European core, thinking of climate justice, reparations, partnerships that strengthen and recognize local sovereignty and authorities, and this kind of utopian thinking, which I think are important to be mentioned. These are just references, and thank you so much for your attention.